Hi, I'm Deboki and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm going to be doing my reading recap for April and May. I figured, first of all, I had not really gotten my recap done for April, and so why not squish it in with May, because also I just didn't really get a whole lot of reading done. So luckily, the format of these recaps, instead of doing wrap-ups, I can just talk about whatever book-related thing I want to talk about. And so even though I don't necessarily have a lot of books that I'm super excited to talk about from the last few months, there are some book-related things that I either want to ask or talk about, and that's why I decided to switch to doing recaps instead of wrap-ups. So today I'm going to start off with a quick audiobook question for you all, and then I'm going to move on to talking about Shadow and Bone, because I am belatedly joining in on that conversation on the Netflix series. And then last, I'm going to be talking about a book that sort of helped me figure out kind of why I've been sort of in a little bit of a recent reading slump of sorts or whatever. So first off, a quick question. Do any of you guys have recommendations for a good audiobook app? So I usually try to buy my audiobooks from Libro FM, and I prefer being able to get my audiobooks in a format where I can support my local bookstore. But I'm having a hard time figuring out how to listen to those files on my computer because Libro FM doesn't have an app. They do let you download the files. So for a while I was trying to kind of put them into my podcast app, which I use Pocket Casts, and I really like it as a podcast app, but they removed the playlist feature, which I think would have been basically the solution to my problem right now. So I don't really have a good way to just kind of compile all of my audiobook files into one book. So there's not really so using Pocket Cast to listen to audiobooks, it works, but it's just a little bit I don't know, just a little bit messy and not as neat as I would like, compared to using something like the Audible app. And if I could put my files into the Audible app and listen to them there, I would probably just do that, but I can't. And I'm trying to move away from using Audible for audiobook purchases, but the fact that I can use it on my computer and on my phone is something that makes it really convenient for me as someone who kind of likes to go between multiple, devices for listening to my audiobooks. I've tried out some other apps like Overcast, which is also a podcast app, and that also people have suggested as a way to listen to audiobooks, but I don't really like Overcast that much. So I'm just having a hard time figuring out if there is a good way to get away from Audible and also be able to listen to books on multiple devices. And also, because this is probably an important detail, I use iOS for everything, like iPad, MacBook, and phone. So yeah, anything that works in that. That is my quick question. Okay, moving on. Shadow and Bone. I am very, very belatedly going to enter the conversation with my thoughts on the series, because not enough people have talked about what they felt about Shadow and Bone, the Netflix adaptation of Leigh Bardugo's Grishaverse series. The Grishaverse is set in this alternate Europe, and particularly Shadow and Bone is set in this alternate version kind of Russia, or fantasy version. Alternate is not the right word. A fantasy version of Russia. The names have been changed, but you know what they are. And the Grisha are witches and they have power, but there's also end of world kind of stuff, or at least end of the country kind of stuff. And then Six of Crows is also set in the Grishaverse, but is primarily set around a group of thieves who have to work together to pull off a heist. And when the series was announced, I was pretty much only excited for the Six of Crows stuff, because I've kind of realized over time and having read more of Bardugo's books, I really like the way she sets moods and creates characters. I really don't like the way she writes magic. There's just something about it that doesn't work for me, and I cannot pinpoint it to you, because I think some of it kind of changes. Ninth House, I have very specific issues that are related to that book itself and what it's trying to do with magic that are not necessarily about the magic itself. It's about how it's applied in that setting. In the Grishaverse series, it's just that somehow there's something about this magic that I just find very uninteresting, which is not really a thing you want to feel about magic. What I'm also beginning to realize, and I think this series kind of has helped me realize, is that I'm not particularly interested in the way she writes plot either. I think the thing that gets me with her books, the thing that grabs me and keeps me invested in them, is the way that she writes characters. Six of Crows, for me and for what I like out of a cast, is pretty much flawless. I mean, okay, that's a stretch. There are a few flaws in some of those characters that are just I don't care about them. But overall, Six of Crows really works for me because it's this, this little crime family, this little found family story that also, the found family is committing crimes together. I'm a huge fan of the show Leverage, and Six of Crows kind of has that, Leverage feel, but, in a fantasy world. With that said, I could not tell you a single thing that happens plot-wise in the Six of Crows duology. I do not remember. Literally all I remember are the characters and the fact that I love them. Do I remember why I love them based on things that have happened to them in the plot? No. I just know that they have done things that have endeared them to me. And I think that's a thing that like the show itself actually really helped to clarify for me. I've seen sort of like a lot of these sort of, is Shadow and Bone like the one good book adaptation? And like, first of all, that's wishbone erasure. Also, I will say, like, aside from the adaptationness of it all, I was kind of very distracted in the first few episodes by, like, the sets and the makeup and the costumes. There was something about the way it was all filmed where it was just, like it felt like you were watching something being filmed. Like, you could see, like, the grains of the highlighter in a way that, like, felt very, like, mid-2010s, like, when people were very into glittery highlighter. It kind of felt like I was seeing that in a fantasy setting. It just felt like, you know, the sets looked like sets, the costumes looked like costumes, the makeup looked like makeup. It didn't all come together in a way where I felt like I was watching a world come together. And that was kind of my feeling for like the first or second episode. It kind of made it a little bit more difficult for me to get into it, but after like the first few episodes, that kind of feeling went away for me. It might have been because I was watching the show while I was sewing, so I wasn't really watching it as intently, so like that visual stuff just wasn't as distracting. It's hard for me to gauge in a way if I think the show is a good adaptation, because what I think it is an accurate adaptation. And when I say that, I don't mean that in terms of it being very faithful to the series, because it is not faithful at all. Like in terms of the entire Six of Crows plot, I was excited to see how they were going to merge Six of Crows into this show, how they were going to combine that and Shadow and Bone, because those take place in very different timelines in the books. But they took some liberties with that. And so, you know, it's definitely not trying to be faithful in that way. And I respect that. I respect the fact that they were like, you know what, we're gonna go all out and we're gonna do this weird thing with the original source material and we're gonna kind of go in a different direction. And I really kind of like that. I feel like, yeah, why not have some fun with that? But when I say that I feel like the show is accurate to the books, what I mean is that I feel like the things that I didn't like about this show in terms of the writing and the story were accurate to things that I didn't like about the books in terms of the writing and the story. So like, for example, like Alina is a character who, you know, kind of has a bad rap, I think, in the fandom because, like, she doesn't really have much of a personality in the books. And I will say that, like, I actually was not super struck by her lack of personality when I read the books, because I was just sort of like, I don't know, she just feels like personalityless the way that a lot of YA protagonists are sometimes, like, you know, sometimes it's difficult to register what their personality is because they're just so encumbered with the role of being the hero or the heroine of the story. But this show did a lot to really kind of establish to me, like, oh, right, this is like actually a thing that I have a tough time with the books. Like, this is why the books have not registered with me in the long term and why I don't really think back on the series and go like, oh yes, I love it. It's because like its main character Alina, as well as like Mal, the other major character who like informs a lot of her choices, neither of them really have a personality except for their strong dedication to each other. Like, I don't really have a sense of their personality after reading the books or watching the show, except for the fact that they are motivated primarily by the desire to keep the others safe. And it's kind of a shame because, like, in the show, I think the actors are pretty charming. It's just the words that are given to them are pretty like meh. I don't really feel like those words give a lot to the actors to work with, except like a great sense of like import and needing to protect this other character, but also just like, oh shit, I can like sun things, I guess. Also, Nia and Matthias were the two characters from Six of Crows that I had the hardest time getting invested in. And I think this show was like actually much worse in that regards, because everything happening with them felt like a complete distraction from the plot. Like, it was not completely clear to me what their connection was to a lot of the events going on. The relevance just like wasn't there, and there were just like periodic references to them, but again, I didn't understand what it was I was supposed to be getting invested in, and so they were a distraction, and then also they were not an entertaining distraction. Because they felt like a distraction from the plot, it seemed like the show didn't often want to switch to them, so like there's this sort of like catch-22 with them where like I didn't know what their relevance to the plot was, so anytime we jumped to them, it felt like a distraction. But because it seemed like then, like, oh, we're only gonna jump to them like periodically to like check in with them, we also didn't check in with them enough to like have them feel like they had their own story. Every time we went to them, it was a distraction, but also it was like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know where this major jump in your relationship has come from, because we haven't even really watched you go through a whole lot together, because you are so secondary to the main plot that's going on. But like I said, the rest of the Six of Crows cast is like what I was excited for with the show. Going into it, like I was kind of like, I don't need all of the Grisha stuff. Just give me the Six of Crows cut. I just want them. I want the version of the show. Like my thing with Game of Thrones has been always that I want a version of the books and I want a version of the show that is like only the characters that I am invested in. And luckily, because of YouTube, I can now watch compilations of just like all of Sansa's scenes or all of Arya's scenes and like that kind of thing, you know? Like I can watch the characters like that I care about and ignore the whole rest of the series if I really want to. So before the show came out, I was kind of like, oh, one day someone is going to compile the Six of Crows cut onto YouTube and I will just watch that. It's clear to me now that that would not have worked, because they made some changes. They put in a confrontation between Kaz and the Darkling, who is this immensely powerful person, but not against this con man, I guess. Does any of the way that Six of Crows was combined with Shadow and Bone make sense? No. Do I care? Also, no. With that said, I do think the fact that they could completely get rid of the original plot of Six of Crows and just collapse it onto Shadow and Bone sort of emphasizes how meaningless the plot was for Six of Crows, because I didn't miss any of it. I didn't really care. I just wanted to see my favorite characters go do their thing, and that was fun. I don't need it always to make sense. I respect the fact that the show went for something that like felt so different from the books, but still at least kept the core of the characters that they had. I am like a little bit worried. I do hope that they flesh out the Six of Crows characters a little bit more in the second season. I hope that like they introduce some of the other ones in there. And I hope that, yeah, I'm curious with where they're gonna go with this, because I think it could be really interesting. I'm like intrigued by the possibility of this like weird collapsed timeline, but I'm also kind of like worried about it, because you never know where it's gonna go and sometimes it could go badly. But for now, I am very intrigued by the many directions that this could go, because if they had Kaz versus the Darkling already, like that for me was sort of fan service in terms of just like, I would have written that as like an absurd plot line that could happen, and the fact that they went there and it was so like weird and absurd and not at all like in line with what I think would happen, I loved it. I loved that it didn't completely make sense. So those are my thoughts about Shadow and Bone and the Netflix series. Moving on to my last thing for today, I just want to talk about a book that like kind of is helping me push through a little bit of a reading slump. And yeah, one of the reasons why I don't have like a whole lot to talk about right now, like reading wise, is just because a thing I'm realizing is that like I think I've been trying to read books that are a little bit too high on the angst or serious factor, and like usually when I'm in a reading slump, my go-to genre is romance. And the thing about romance that's great, especially for a reading slump, is that, you know, you go in sort of knowing what you're getting. Like, you know that you're getting a happy ending, you know that, especially if you're like reading an author who you're familiar with, you kind of have a sense for like what level of angst and stuff you're in for, and you know, maybe even like a sense of what kind of beats you're in for. And there's sort of a sense of familiarity in there where even if there are things that are going to surprise you, you have something kind of just like familiar and comforting to go to. And the other thing with romance is that it's often, you know, written to be a fast and easy read. And I say that not to deride it. I say that because I think that's a thing that makes romance so great as a genre, and what romance writers are so great at is being able to write fast-paced stories that you get really invested in, and like, you know, you might read in a night very quickly because you just want to like quickly turn the page and move on and see what's going to happen next. You know, they're not books that are like designed to slow you down. They're books that are designed to get you to the end and to get really excited about the ending. So that's why I think romance is just so great for a lot of reading slumps. But I think one of the challenges I've been having lately, especially because I've gone on these Kindle Unlimited binges that have become increasingly angsty, and I'm just like I think the thing with romance is you get into one author and like you start to branch out into other authors who are similar, and sometimes that can have you building on on the wrong parts of the book that you are excited about. And for me, like, yeah, it's just been it's been getting like increasingly angsty and serious. And I didn't realize that like maybe right now I'm just like in a place where I don't want to read a lot of angsty books. I think like just mentally lot going on. I think I wanted something brighter and more optimistic and happier, but I didn't like realize that because I was just kind of like, oh, hey, I love romance. If I read this romance book, I'm going to feel pretty good about it. And like just coming out of these reading situations not actually feeling good about it. And when I say that, I don't mean like the books are bad or that they made me feel bad. It's just like I didn't come out of them feeling like, just like, oh yeah, I enjoyed that. It was just like, this was not the right book for me at this moment. And I didn't like really put it together that like, hey, maybe the books you're reading right now are just like a little bit too on the angsty side, because I do love a good angsty read. I especially love a good angsty romance read. So like that is like usually not a huge problem for me, but I didn't like put together that like maybe I've been reading a bit too much of them, especially for where I'm at in my mood right now and like where things are in my life right now, like, other stuff going on. I didn't like have that like moment of insight that was like, hey, what if you tried to read something that was just kind of like happy, like obviously those angsty romances have a happy ending, they're still romances, but like there's a lot of angst until that point. I didn't have that moment of just like, hey, what if you read something that was kind of like sweet and cute before the happy ending too? Like they don't need to like go through all of this like emotional baggage bullshit to get to the happy ending. So all of this preamble is to say that the book that I read that helped me sort of realize this is actually an arc for So We Meet Again by Suzanne Park, which is coming out this summer. It's coming out August 3rd. I got this arc from NetGalley, and in general, I have not been a huge NetGalley person just because I like have not been a huge arc person. I've read a handful of arcs, like I've had a handful of books sent to me from publishers, and I just like with like NetGalley and Edelweiss, I just like have not really gotten super into them. My thought process as someone who goes to the library for most of my books is like, hey, I'll read the books eventually when they get to the library. And there just haven't been that many books where I've been like so excited for them where I'm like, I have to read it as soon as it exists in the world. Like before it's even released, I need to read the advanced copy, like all of that stuff. But I'm also trying to like branch out more in terms of how I do my reading. And I think arcs in particular to me kind of are a good way to keep track of what's going on in publishing right now. They're a good way to have a sense for like where publishing's priorities are and like getting a sense of where, as someone who talks about books on BookTube and like all this stuff, like kind of where I want my priorities to be in terms of books I'm going to be talking about in the next few months. So I'm trying to like kind of be a little bit more proactive about NetGalley and all of that stuff. But that is not the point for this. The point for this is that I read this book, So We Meet Again, which is coming out August 3rd, and I really, really loved it. So We Meet Again is about this banker named Jessie Kim who gets laid off from her banking job in New York City in the beginning of the book, and then she goes to move back in with her family in Nashville, where she reconnects with a guy from her childhood named Daniel Choi. They grew up together in their Nashville Korean community, so like she's kind of grown up with that sort of like, hey, we're the same age. We've been compared to each other because we're all in the same like immigrant community, that sort of vibe with him. But now they're reconnecting as adults and like he's kind of hot, but she's still kind of irritated with him because she's trying to figure out her life. And in the meantime, alongside all of that, she's also now trying to resurrect her abandoned cooking YouTube channel, which Daniel actually ends up helping her with, even though, again, she kind of like has this youthful resentment against him. I had this whole preamble about angst, but this is not an angst-free book because it is still a romance book, which means that it's contending with something in the world of the characters that is, some kind of obstacle, both personal or between the characters. In the case of So We Meet Again, Jessie has been dealing with, a lot of racist and sexist bullshit in the New York banking scene, which is not surprising, but it is still very real and visceral for her because it leads to her getting laid off, and it also just affects her daily life in terms of the way she's been treated as someone working in that industry. So one of the things I loved about the book is the way that she is processing that, the way that she's processing the way that she was treated, and against the way that kind of like intersected with the way that she approached work, and especially now as someone who was laid off, like how that's going to affect her next steps, like how that affects the kind of career she wants for herself going forward. And at the same time, like that it's dealing with these serious issues, it's also very sweet and kind of rom-com-y in a way that I like very much gravitated to, because that is apparently the thing I didn't know that I wanted. Jesse and Daniel's dynamic in particular reminded me a lot of growing up in a Bengali community and like all of us kids and how we related to each other. And I just liked seeing how that translated in these characters into like how they relate as adults. I also really love the way that the book shows Jesse pursuing this creative career, but also very much addressing the business of it all, of addressing the business of being a YouTuber. And I think sometimes the book kind of glosses over big business things in a way that is like a little bit weird. Like she kind of just like resurrects her YouTube channel, does a really popular Instagram live, and is suddenly very successful. And so there are some little moments there where like I felt like it kind of glossed over things in a way that, you know, I would have loved to see a little bit more fleshed out. But I felt like overall the arc felt very like earned for her still. Like I felt like even if I didn't always see the moments of Jessie doing that work, I believed that it happened. You know, like I believed that she was successful because the book took so much care to show the ways that she was working and the ways that she was passionate about what she was doing in a way where like, it's like, yeah, I buy it. And I also want it for her. I want her to be successful at this. And I love the idea of how she's approaching this YouTube cooking channel. I love the way that it also drew in her family and made them a part of her success. I just loved a lot of the way that came together. One of the things I'll say is that I think this is technically a romance novel, but it like reads a little bit more like women's fiction with a very, very secondary romantic plot. The romance felt a little bit kind of glossed over, and it's weird to say that because I do think that the book did a lot to build the relationship between Jesse and Daniel over the course of like all of the events, but like the romantic side of their relationship, I bought it, but it's sort of the same as like the YouTube stuff where I bought it because of like individual moments that I'm like rooting for, but not because I felt like the book actually necessarily did a strong job of like weaving those moments together and making them feel smooth. And for most of the book, that wasn't an issue. The main point where it became a little bit frustrating was when there was tension between the two, because I felt like the stakes for their romance was just like not very high, just because the romantic side of their relationship did not feel as deep as the rest of the stuff that was going on in the book. But like I said, I really love this book and it helped me out of a reading slump. It just felt like the right book for the moment and felt like the kind of uplifting, sweet story I needed at this time. So I would recommend it if you find yourself in August or later looking for something similar, because I think it's a very sweet book and I'm excited to now read more of Suzanne Parks' work. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you have thoughts on a good audiobook app, on Shadow and Bone, on, you know, getting yourselves out of a reading slump, or recommendations for other sweet romance novels that are a little bit lower on the angsty side, let me know down below. And yeah, bye.